My boss called me Deadweight at the company party in front of everyone. He laughed as his golden boy replacement shook hands with the investors. I handed him my resignation letter right there on the spot. He went pale when he saw what else was attached to it. But let me tell you exactly how I heard those words that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was standing in the marble lobby of the Meridian Hotel's grand ballroom, my black heels clicking softly against the polished stone as I balanced a crystal glass of champagne that I hadn't touched. The annual Sterling Technologies Christmas Gala was in full swing around me, filled with the sound of forced laughter and networking conversations that would be forgotten by morning. The chandeliers cast warm golden light across the faces of my colleagues, all dressed in their finest evening wear, celebrating another year of record profits. The ballroom felt alive with corporate ambition, filled with the energy of people who believed they were building something important together. I had been with Sterling Technologies for 8 years, 8 years of 60-hour weeks, missed family dinners, and sacrificed weekends. 8 years of believing that hard work and dedication would eventually be rewarded. 8 years of trusting that my contributions mattered to the company I had helped build from a mid-sized consulting firm into a regional powerhouse. I was Dr. Samantha Reed, Senior Director of Strategic Operations, the woman who had streamlined their entire project management system, implemented the quality control protocols that had saved them millions in potential lawsuits, and personally managed the client relationships that generated 40% of their annual revenue. The woman who had a PhD in operations management from Northwestern and an MBA from Wharton. The woman who had been passed over for promotion 3 times in favor of less qualified male colleagues. But on that particular December evening, as I stood watching my boss Richard Hartwell hold court near the executive bar, I still believed that my value to the company was recognized and appreciated. I still trusted that the late nights and sacrificed personal time had been investments in a future that would include me in the leadership decisions that shaped Sterling's direction. Richard Hartwell was 52 years old, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of smooth confidence that came from never having to question whether he deserved the opportunities that had been handed to him. He was the executive vice president of operations, my direct supervisor, and the man who had been taking credit for my innovations for the past 3 years. The man who presented my strategic analyses to the board as his own insights, who claimed responsibility for the efficiency improvements I had designed, and who somehow always managed to be in meetings with senior leadership when my project succeeded, while ensuring I was handling crisis management when things went wrong. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of our department's achievements, and I had been specifically invited to join the executive circle for what Richard called an important announcement about the future of operations. I assumed it was finally time for the promotion that had been dangled in front of me like a carrot for the past 18 months. The promotion to Vice President of Strategic Development that would finally give me the authority to implement the comprehensive reforms I had been proposing. As I approached the group gathered around Richard, I could see him gesturing enthusiastically while speaking to Marcus Chen, our CEO, and several members of the board of directors. Next to him stood someone I didn't recognize, a younger man in an expensive suit who was nodding, along with Richard's presentation with the confident smile of someone who already knew he belonged in the conversation. The stranger had to be David Morrison, the new hire I had been hearing whispers about for the past month. The golden boy from McKinsey who had been brought in as a quote-unquote consultant at a salary that rumors suggested was substantially higher than my own. The man who had been given a corner office despite having zero experience in our industry and no knowledge of our client base or operational systems. I had been told that David was temporary, brought in to provide an outside perspective on some specific projects. I had even been asked to prepare comprehensive briefings for him, detailed analyses of our current operations, and strategic recommendations for improvement. I had spent weeks creating presentations that outlined every aspect of our departmental functions, assuming that this information would help him provide more informed consulting advice. Standing on the periphery of their conversation, champagne glass growing warm in my hand, I caught fragments of what Richard was saying to the board members. The operations department has never been stronger, he was explaining. his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "We've implemented revolutionary changes that have transformed our efficiency and client satisfaction ratings." I felt a flutter of pride, assuming he was finally acknowledging the work I had done to achieve those improvements. The process optimization protocols I had designed, the client relationship management system I had created, the quality assurance measures I had fought to implement despite resistance from other departments. Perhaps this was the moment when my contributions would be properly recognized. "Revolutionary changes," Marcus Chen repeated, clearly impressed. "These efficiency improvements have exceeded every projection we made last year. The client retention rate alone has saved us millions in acquisition costs." Richard smiled broadly, his chest swelling with pride as he accepted praise for achievements he had systematically claimed as his own. Of course, none of this would have been possible without bringing in the right kind of talent. Someone with the vision to see the big picture and the expertise to execute at the highest level. That's when Richard gestured toward David Morrison, and I felt the first cold finger of understanding trace down my spine. David here has been instrumental in developing these innovations. His background in strategic consulting and his fresh perspective on operational efficiency have been exactly what we needed to take the department to the next level. I froze, my champagne glass suddenly feeling like it weighed 10 pounds. David Morrison had been with the company for less than 6 weeks. The innovations Richard was describing had taken me 3 years to develop and implement. The strategic insights he was crediting to David were contained in the briefing materials I had prepared, the same materials that had been based on my own research and analysis. David accepted the praise with practiced humility, shaking hands with board members while explaining his philosophy of operational excellence in language that sounded remarkably similar to the presentations I had been giving for years. "It's all about understanding the intersection of human resources and systematic efficiency," he said, echoing almost word for word a presentation I had delivered to this same group of executives 6 months earlier. The conversation continued around me, but I was no longer fully present. I watched as if from a great distance, as Richard introduced David to various senior leaders, describing him as the architect of our department's success, the man who would be leading our expansion into new markets, the visionary who would be spearheading our next phase of growth. That's when I heard Marcus Chen ask the question that would change everything. "So Richard, what's the timeline for David's transition into the permanent leadership role?" Permanent leadership role. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stepped closer to the group, abandoning any pretense of casual.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Eavesdropping. Richard's response confirmed my worst fears and exceeded them. "We're planning to announce David's promotion to Vice President of Strategic Development after the new year," Richard said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "He'll be taking over full operational oversight and will be reporting directly to me. It's exactly the kind of dynamic leadership our department needs to stay competitive." The promotion that had been promised to me. The position I had been working toward for years. The role that would have finally given me the authority to implement the comprehensive reforms I had been advocating. It was being handed to someone who had been with the company for 6 weeks and whose primary qualification seemed to be his willingness to take credit for my work. I must have made some sound, some involuntary gasp or intake of breath, because Richard suddenly noticed my presence on the edge of their conversation. "Samantha," he said, his tone shifting to the patronizing warmth he used when he wanted something from me. Perfect timing. "I was just telling everyone about the exciting changes we're implementing in the new year." "Exciting changes," I repeated, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "I see David will be taking over strategic development." Richard's smile faltered slightly, perhaps sensing the tension in my voice, but he recovered quickly. "David brings a fresh perspective that will complement your operational expertise beautifully. You'll be working closely together to ensure a smooth transition of responsibilities." A smooth transition of responsibilities. I realized with crystalline clarity that Richard was describing my demotion in corporate speak. David would be taking over the strategic aspects of my role while I would be relegated to operational implementation. I would become his subordinate, responsible for executing the plans and policies that he would claim to have developed, even though they would inevitably be based on my own research and recommendations. "What about the vice president position?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled. I thought we had discussed my candidacy for that role. The silence that followed my question was deafening. Richard exchanged glances with Marcus Chen and several board members, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to confused. It was clear that my candidacy had never been seriously considered, despite months of conversations where Richard had encouraged my ambitions and praised my qualifications. "Well," Richard said finally, his tone now carrying an edge of irritation. The board felt that David's strategic consulting background made him the ideal candidate for a leadership position. "Your strengths have always been more in the operational implementation side of things." Operational implementation. I had a PhD in operations management and an MBA from one of the top business schools in the country. I had published papers on strategic efficiency and had been invited to speak at industry conferences. But in Richard's assessment, my strengths were in implementation rather than strategy. "I see," I said, setting my champagne glass down on a nearby table with more force than necessary. "And what exactly will my role be under this new structure?" Richard's discomfort was becoming more obvious, but he pressed forward with the corporate doublespeak that was clearly intended to make my demotion sound like an opportunity. "You'll be Senior Manager of Operational Excellence, working directly with David to execute the strategic initiatives he develops. It's a vital role that plays to your particular skill set." Senior Manager. After 8 years with the company, after building their entire operational framework from scratch, after generating millions in revenue and savings, I was being demoted to a position that was 2 levels below what I currently held. And I was expected to be grateful for the opportunity to implement strategies that would inevitably be based on my own ideas but credited to someone else. The group was clearly eager to move on from this uncomfortable conversation, but I wasn't finished. "This particular skill set that you mentioned, Richard, could you elaborate on what you mean by that?" Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, and I could see him calculating whether he should continue with diplomatic language or be more direct. "Your attention to detail is excellent, Samantha. You're very good at following through on directives and ensuring that policies are properly implemented. Those are valuable skills in any organization, following through on directives, implementing policies." This was how Richard characterized the work of someone who had designed those policies in the first place, the work of someone who had identified the problems, researched the solutions, and developed the strategic frameworks that had transformed the entire department. But David Morrison, who had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort, decided to interject with what he apparently thought was helpful clarification. "I think what Richard is trying to say is that everyone has different strengths. Some people are naturally suited for big-picture strategic thinking, while others excel at the detailed work of making sure everything runs smoothly." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. This man, who had been with the company for 6 weeks, who had learned everything he knew about our operations from materials I had prepared, was explaining to me that some people were suited for strategic thinking, while others were better at detailed work. The implication was clear. He was naturally suited for strategy, while I was naturally suited for details. That's when Richard made the comment that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "The truth is, Samantha, we need people who can handle the heavy lifting without getting bogged down in ego or ambition. Some employees are content to be the engine that keeps things running, while others are destined to be the drivers who determine the direction. You've always been reliable deadweight that keeps the ship stable." Deadweight. In front of the CEO, the board of directors, and dozens of my colleagues, Richard Hartwell had just described me as deadweight. Not just unambitious or detail-oriented, but deadweight. A burden that the ship had to carry rather than an asset that provided value. The silence that followed his comment was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the party seemed to fade as the weight of what he had said settled over the group. Marcus Chen looked genuinely shocked. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, and David Morrison appeared to be trying to disappear into his expensive suit. But Richard, perhaps emboldened by what he mistook for supportive silence, decided to elaborate on his assessment. "Don't get me wrong, every organization needs workers who are content to stay in their lane and focus on execution rather than innovation. Samantha fills that role perfectly. She's not going to rock the boat or challenge the strategic direction, but she'll make sure the work gets done. Workers who stay in their lane. content to focus on execution rather than innovation. This was how Richard characterized someone who had revolutionized their operational systems and generated millions in additional revenue. This was how he described someone whose innovations he had been taking credit for years. I felt something shift inside me at that moment, something fundamental and irreversible. The loyal employee who had been willing to work extra hours and sacrifice personal time for the good of the company was disappearing. The woman who had believed that hard work and expertise would eventually be recognized and rewarded was being replaced by someone colder, more calculating, and absolutely determined to ensure that Richard Hartwell's casual cruelty would have consequences he could never have imagined. I reached into my evening bag and pulled out the envelope I had been carrying with me for the past 2 weeks. The envelope that contained my resignation letter, drafted during a moment of frustration but never submitted because I had still believed that things might improve. The envelope that had been intended as a backup plan but was now about to become my declaration of independence. "Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet group, "I have something for you." I handed him the envelope with a smile that felt strange on my face. Cold and sharp, and completely unlike any expression I had ever worn in a professional setting. Richard took the envelope with obvious confusion, clearly not understanding why I would be giving him documents at a cocktail party. "What's this?" he asked, his tone suggesting mild annoyance at being interrupted during his moment of triumph. "My resignation," I replied simply. "Effective immediately." Richard's face went white as he processed what I had said. Around us, the group began to murmur with surprise and concern. Marcus Chen stepped forward, clearly trying to understand what had just happened. "Samantha," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled. "I think there may have been some misunderstanding here. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." But I wasn't finished. "Richard," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, "since you've just publicly characterized me as deadweight, I thought it would be appropriate to publicly relieve you of that burden." I turned to address the entire group, making eye contact with each board member and senior executive. For those of you who might be interested in the details, I've attached a comprehensive summary of my contributions to this company over the past 8 years, the innovations that have been attributed to others, the revenue I've generated, and the strategic recommendations that have been implemented without acknowledgement. Richard was frantically opening the envelope, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out the documents inside. His face grew progressively paler as he scanned the contents, clearly recognizing the detailed documentation of his systematic theft of credit for my work. I've also included copies of all correspondence related to the projects that David will apparently be taking credit for, along with time-stamped documentation proving that these strategies were developed months before he joined the company. I'm sure you'll find it illuminating reading. The silence in our immediate area had begun to spread outward as other party guests noticed the tension and stopped their own conversations to observe what was happening. I could feel dozens of eyes on us as I delivered what amounted to a public indictment of Richard's leadership. Marcus Chen was clearly trying to salvage the situation, but I could see in his expression that he was beginning to understand the implications of what I was revealing. "Samantha," he said again, "I think we should continue this conversation in private. There may be some misunderstandings that can be resolved." "There's no misunderstanding, Marcus," I replied. "Richard has made it clear that he considers me deadweight, and I've decided to take that assessment to its logical conclusion. I'm removing myself from a situation where my contributions aren't valued, and my expertise isn't respected." I turned back to Richard, who was still staring at the documents in his hands with growing horror. "Thank you for 8 years of education, Richard. You've taught me exactly how much loyalty and hard work are worth in this organization. Consider this my graduation." Before anyone could respond, I turned and walked away from the group, my heels clicking purposefully against the marble floor as I made my way toward the ballroom exit. Behind me, I could hear the urgent whispers and confused questions of people trying to understand what had just happened, but I didn't look back. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt like the longest and shortest journey of my professional life. As the doors closed behind me, cutting off the sounds of the party that would undoubtedly be dominated by speculation about my dramatic exit, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete and absolute freedom. Richard Hartwell thought he had just rid himself of an inconvenient employee who had been asking too many questions about recognition, and advancement. He had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The woman he had dismissed as deadweight was about to become the architect of his professional destruction. But this story didn't begin with my resignation in a hotel ballroom. The foundation of Richard's betrayal had been built over years, one stolen idea and denied promotion at a time. And my response hadn't been planned in a moment of anger. It had been carefully constructed over months of growing awareness that my value to Sterling Technologies was being systematically undermined by a man who saw my competence as a threat rather than an asset. To understand how Richard Hartwell had made himself vulnerable to the kind of systematic exposure I was about to orchestrate, you need to understand how we had gotten to that moment. How a loyal employee had been transformed into someone capable of bringing down her boss with surgical precision. How 8 years of subtle manipulation and credit theft had created the perfect conditions for a corporate takedown that would destroy more than just Richard's career. The real story had begun 6 months earlier, when I first started to suspect that my contributions were being deliberately minimized. When I began to notice patterns in how my ideas were presented and my achievements were attributed to others. When I started documenting everything, not because I was planning revenge, but because I was trying to protect myself from exactly the kind of public humiliation I had just experienced. Richard had been systematic in his theft of credit for my work, but he had also been arrogant. He had never imagined that the woman he was exploiting might be documenting his deception. He had never considered that someone he viewed as deadweight might actually be brilliant enough to build a case against him that would be impossible to refute. As I drove home from the party, the city lights blurring past my window, I thought about the folder of evidence I had been building for months. The emails where Richard claimed ownership of my strategies. The recorded meetings where he presented my analyses as his own insights. The financial documentation proving that my innovations had generated specific revenue increases that he had taken credit for in his performance reviews. Richard thought he had just solved a personnel problem by driving me to resign. He had no idea that he had just declared war on someone who had been preparing for battle longer than he knew. Someone who had the documentation, the expertise, and now the motivation to systematically destroy everything he had built on the foundation of stolen achievements. The game was about to begin, and Richard Hartwell had no idea that he had just handed his opponent every advantage she needed to win. Tomorrow, the real work would start. Tonight, I was going to open a bottle of wine and begin planning the most comprehensive corporate takedown in Sterling Technologies history. Because sometimes, when someone calls you deadweight, the best response isn't anger. It's precision. The morning after the party, I woke up in my downtown apartment with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The anger from the previous evening had crystallized into something far more dangerous: purpose. While Richard Hartwell was probably sleeping off his celebration, confident that he had successfully eliminated a troublesome employee, I was already 3 steps ahead in a game he didn't even know we were playing. My resignation wouldn't be effective for 2 weeks, according to company policy. That gave me 14 days of access to Sterling Technologies systems, files, and personnel. 14 days to gather evidence, build alliances, and construct a case that would systematically dismantle Richard's career while exposing the full scope of his fraudulent activities. I started with coffee and a legal pad, mapping out everything I knew about Richard's pattern of stealing credit for my work. The process optimization system that had reduced client processing time by 30%. The quality assurance protocols that had eliminated costly errors. The client relationship management framework that had increased retention rates by 25%. All innovations I had developed, researched, and implemented, but which Richard had presented to senior leadership as his own strategic vision. The beauty of Richard's arrogance was that he had documented his own deception. Every email where he claimed ownership of my ideas. Every presentation where he used my research without attribution. Every performance review where he took credit for revenue increases generated by my innovations. He had created a paper trail that would be impossible to deny once properly organized and presented. But I needed more than just evidence of credit theft. I needed to understand the full scope of Richard's incompetence and the damage his leadership was causing to the company. I needed allies who could corroborate my experiences and provide additional evidence of his mismanagement. Most importantly, I needed a strategy that would ensure the truth reached people with the power to act on it. The Sterling Technologies building felt different as I walked through the lobby that Monday morning. The marble floors and glass elevators that had once represented professional aspiration now felt like the set of a corporate thriller where I was both the detective and the key witness. Every conversation, every document, every interaction was now potential evidence in the case I was building against Richard. My first stop was the Information Technology Department, where I had developed a friendship with Elena Vasquez over the years. Elena was the senior systems administrator, a brilliant woman who had been passed over for promotion almost as many times as I had. More importantly, she was the person who maintained the digital records of every email, document, and file transfer within the company. Elena looked up from her workstation as I approached, her expression immediately showing concern. "Sam, I heard about what happened at the party. Are you okay?" Word travels fast in corporate environments, especially when someone makes a dramatic exit from a company event. I had expected that my confrontation with Richard would be the subject of office gossip, but I hadn't anticipated how quickly the story would spread or how many people would reach out to express support. "I'm better than okay," I replied, settling into the chair next to her desk. "But I need your help with something important." Elena leaned closer, lowering her voice. "What kind of help?" "I need to document every email and file that's been sent from my accounts over the past 3 years, particularly anything that was forwarded to Richard or used in presentations to senior leadership." Elena's eyes widened as she understood the implications of my request. "You're building a case against him." "I'm protecting myself," I clarified. "And potentially protecting other people who might be experiencing similar issues." What Elena revealed over the next hour was more damaging than I had imagined. The digital forensics showed a clear pattern of Richard systematically copying my work, removing my name from documents, and presenting my analyses as his own research. But more than that, the email trails revealed communications with David Morrison that dated back 3 months before his official start date. "Look at this," Elena said, pulling up a series of emails between Richard and David. "They've been planning David's transition into your role since September. Richard's been sending him copies of your strategic recommendations and project summaries, apparently as, quote, background material for his consulting work." The emails were devastating. Not only had Richard been planning to replace me for months, but he had been providing David with my proprietary research and strategic analyses, allowing him to present himself as the architect of innovations he had nothing to do with creating. "There's more," Elena continued, her voice growing more concerned. "Richard's been copying other people's work too. I can see patterns of file access and chandeliers forwarding that suggest he's been taking credit for innovations from at least 4 other department members." The scope of Richard's fraud was larger than I had realized. He wasn't just stealing credit from me. He was running a systematic operation that involved claiming ownership of multiple employees' contributions. This wasn't just personal betrayal. It was corporate fraud on a scale that could expose Sterling Technologies to serious legal liability. "Can you document all of this?" I asked. "Already am," Elena replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm creating a comprehensive audit trail of file access, email forwards, and document modifications. If Richard tries to claim he developed any of these innovations, we'll have time-stamped proof that the original work came from other people." My next ally came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh was a junior analyst in our department, someone I had mentored over the past 2 years. She approached me during lunch, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by nervous determination. "Dr. Reed," she said, sliding into the seat across from me in the company cafeteria, "I heard about your resignation, and I need to tell you something important." Jennifer had been working directly with David Morrison for the past month, helping him understand our departmental processes and client relationships. What she had observed was a pattern of behavior that confirmed my worst suspicions about his qualifications and competence. "He doesn't understand anything," Jennifer explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've had to explain basic concepts that any consultant should know. Yesterday, he asked me what ROI stands for. He's been copying your presentations word for word and presenting them as his own analysis to clients." The revelation was simultaneously satisfying and terrifying. Satisfying because it confirmed that David Morrison was as incompetent as I had suspected. Terrifying because it meant that Sterling's clients were receiving strategic advice from someone who didn't understand fundamental business concepts. "There's something else," Jennifer continued. "I've been keeping notes because some of the things he's been saying didn't make sense." He told one client that their inventory management system was inefficient, but he was reading directly from your analysis of a completely different company's operations. The implications were staggering. David wasn't just taking credit for my work. He was providing incorrect strategic advice to clients because he didn't understand the context or application of the research he was plagiarizing. This created potential liability issues that could result in client lawsuits and significant financial damages to Sterling Technologies. "Would you be willing to document these incidents?" I asked. "I've already started," Jennifer replied, pulling a small notebook from her purse. "I've been writing down everything because I was worried about getting blamed if something went wrong. I never imagined it was part of a larger pattern." My investigation expanded as word spread through the company that I was building a case against Richard. Other employees began approaching me, some with similar stories of having their work attributed to others, others with evidence of Richard's incompetence and poor decision-making. Marcus Webb from the Financial Analysis Department revealed that Richard had been claiming credit for cost-saving measures that Marcus had proposed and implemented. The savings had been substantial enough to contribute to Richard's performance bonuses over the past 2 years. Lisa Chen from Client Relations provided documentation of instances where Richard had made commitments to clients without understanding the operational implications, leaving her team to manage the resulting problems, while Richard took credit for successful damage control. Tom Rodriguez from Quality Assurance had been documenting Richard's attempts to circumvent safety protocols and quality standards in order to reduce costs and improve efficiency metrics, decisions that could have exposed the company to serious liability if they had resulted in client problems. The pattern that emerged was clear and damning. Richard Hartwell wasn't just stealing credit for other people's work. He was fundamentally incompetent as a manager and was creating serious risks for Sterling Technologies through his poor decision-making and lack of understanding of basic business operations. But the most crucial ally in my growing network came from outside the company. My former professor at Northwestern, Dr. Patricia Williams, had become a prominent consultant specializing in corporate governance and employment law. When I called her to discuss my situation, she immediately recognized the legal implications of what I was describing. "Samantha," Dr. Williams said during our coffee meeting downtown, "what you're describing isn't just workplace politics or personality conflicts. This is systematic fraud, and it creates serious liability for the company." Dr. Williams explained that Richard's pattern of claiming credit for other employees' work could constitute fraud if it had influenced his compensation, promotions, or performance evaluations. More seriously, his practice of providing strategic advice based on plagiarized work he didn't understand could expose Sterling Technologies to client lawsuits and professional liability claims. "You need to be very careful about how you handle this," she warned. "But you also need to understand that you have a responsibility to protect the company and your colleagues from the potential consequences of Richard's behavior." Dr. Williams introduced me to Sarah Mitchell, an employment attorney who specialized in whistleblower cases and corporate fraud. Sarah's assessment of my evidence was both encouraging and sobering. "You have an exceptionally strong case," Sarah told me during our initial consultation. "The documentation is comprehensive. The pattern of behavior is clear, and the potential damages to the company are substantial. But you need to be prepared for the possibility that Sterling Technologies might try to protect Richard, rather than acknowledge the scope of the problem." Sarah helped me understand the legal protections available to whistleblowers and the proper procedures for reporting corporate fraud. More importantly, she helped me develop a strategy for presenting my evidence in a way that would be impossible for the company to ignore or dismiss. Meanwhile, my resignation had created unexpected problems for Richard. Without me to handle the operational details of our department, critical projects were falling behind schedule. Client relationships that I had been managing were becoming strained, as David Morrison struggled to understand complex account histories and strategic requirements. The irony was perfect. Richard had dismissed me as deadweight, but my departure was revealing exactly how much weight I had been carrying. Systems that had run smoothly under my management were beginning to break down. Clients who had been satisfied with our service levels were starting to complain about communication failures and strategic inconsistencies. Elena kept me informed about the growing chaos in our department through discreet messages and lunch meetings. "Richard's been working 16-hour days trying to handle everything you used to manage," she reported, with barely concealed satisfaction. "He asked me if there was any way to delay your departure date." The request was both pathetic and revealing. The man who had called me deadweight was now desperately trying to prevent me from leaving, because he was finally understanding how much work I had been doing behind the scenes. But Richard's biggest mistake was his handling of the client crisis that emerged during my second week of notice. Pinnacle Industries, one of our largest accounts, had discovered inconsistencies in the strategic recommendations they had been receiving. The analysis they had been given was based on operational data from a different company in a completely different industry. The error was a direct result of David Morrison's incompetence, but the client relationship failure fell on Richard as the department head. Pinnacle Industries was threatening to terminate their contract and demanding compensation for strategic advice that had led to costly operational changes. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The crisis provided the perfect opportunity to present my evidence to senior leadership as part of a comprehensive analysis of departmental problems rather than a personal grievance against Richard. I requested a meeting with Marcus Chen, framing it as a briefing on departmental issues that needed to be addressed to prevent further client problems. Marcus, who was clearly concerned about the Pinnacle Industries situation, agreed to meet with me immediately. The conference room felt different as I set up my presentation materials. This wasn't a performance review or a project briefing. This was the opening argument in a case that would determine the trajectory of multiple careers and potentially the future of our entire department. "Marcus," I began, "the Pinnacle Industries crisis isn't an isolated incident. It's symptomatic of systematic problems in departmental leadership that have been developing over several years." I had prepared a comprehensive presentation that laid out the evidence methodically and objectively. The documentation of credit theft, the examples of incompetent decision-making, the client relationship failures, and the operational breakdowns that had occurred since David Morrison's arrival. But the most damaging evidence was the financial analysis I had prepared, showing the actual cost of Richard's mismanagement. The revenue losses from client dissatisfaction, the inefficiencies created by poor strategic decisions, and the potential liability exposure from the advisory services David had been providing based on plagiarized work he didn't understand. The total financial impact over the past 3 years is approximately $2.3 million in lost revenue and increased operational costs, I explained, highlighting the key figures on my presentation. This doesn't include the potential liability exposure from the Pinnacle Industries situation or similar cases where inappropriate strategic advice was provided. Marcus listened in silence as I presented evidence that painted a picture of systematic fraud and incompetence. When I finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of what I had revealed. "Why didn't you bring this to my attention sooner?" he asked finally. "Because I hoped the problems could be resolved through internal processes," I replied. I raised concerns about credit attribution and decision-making authority multiple times, but those concerns were dismissed or minimized. Marcus nodded slowly. "What do you recommend we do about this situation?" This was the moment I had been preparing for. The moment when my strategy would either succeed or fail, based on how effectively I could present solutions rather than just problems. "I recommend a comprehensive audit of departmental operations and strategic decisions over the past 3 years," I said. "I recommend a review of personnel decisions and performance evaluations to determine whether they were based on accurate information. And I recommend immediate action to address the client relationship issues before they result in additional contract terminations." Marcus was clearly wrestling with the implications of what I had presented. Acknowledging the scope of Richard's fraud would require admitting that senior leadership had failed to provide adequate oversight. It would also require potentially costly legal and financial remediation. "I need to discuss this with the board," Marcus said finally. "Can you provide me with copies of all the documentation you've presented?" "Of course," I replied. But Marcus, there's something else you need to know. I pulled out the final piece of evidence I had been saving. A comprehensive analysis of similar situations at other companies, prepared with Dr. Williams' assistance, showing the legal and financial consequences of failing to address systematic fraud in corporate environments. Companies that fail to take prompt action when presented with evidence of this type of fraud often face much more serious consequences, I explained. Regulatory investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and criminal liability for executives who knowingly allowed fraudulent behavior to continue. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Sterling Technologies could address this problem internally and limit the damage, or they could ignore it and face potentially catastrophic external consequences. Marcus understood exactly what I was communicating. "I'll have an answer for you by the end of the week," he said. As I left the conference room, I felt the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. I had presented Richard's fraud not as a personal grievance, but as a business problem that required immediate action. I had provided not just evidence of wrongdoing, but analysis of the financial impact and recommendations for remediation. Most importantly, I had made it clear that ignoring the problem was not an option. Sterling Technologies would have to choose between protecting Richard and protecting themselves, and the choice was obvious. Richard had no idea what was coming. He thought he had successfully eliminated a troublesome employee and secured his position by bringing in a compliant replacement. He had no idea that his own arrogance and systematic fraud had given me every tool I needed to destroy his career and expose him as the incompetent fraud he really was. The game was far from over, but I was already several moves ahead. Richard Hartwell was about to learn that calling someone deadweight can be a fatal mistake when that person happens to be smarter, more prepared, and more strategic than you ever imagined. The real reckoning was about to begin, and I was ready for whatever came next. The call came on Thursday morning while I was reviewing the final details of my transition documentation. Marcus Chen's assistant requested that I attend an emergency board meeting scheduled for Friday afternoon. The timing was perfect. My last official day at Sterling Technologies would end with what I suspected would be Richard Hartwell's professional execution. I spent Thursday evening preparing for what would essentially be my closing argument. The evidence was overwhelming, the financial impact was undeniable, and the legal risks of inaction were clear. But I also knew that corporate politics could sometimes override logic and evidence. Richard had allies on the board, people who had benefited from his willingness to take credit for others' work and present optimistic reports about departmental performance. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made everything feel sharp and focused. I dressed carefully in my best charcoal suit, the one I had worn to important client presentations and board meetings. Today, I would be presenting the most important case of my career, not for Sterling Technologies, but against one of their senior executives. The boardroom was already occupied when I arrived. Marcus Chen sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, flanked by the 5 members of Sterling's board of directors. Richard was seated across from my designated chair, his usual confident demeanor notably absent. David Morrison sat beside him, looking like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. What Richard didn't know was that 2 additional people had been invited to observe the proceedings. Sarah Mitchell, the employment attorney, was present as my legal counsel. Dr. Patricia Williams was there as an independent expert on corporate governance issues. Their presence transformed what might have been an internal disciplinary meeting into something resembling a formal legal proceeding. "Before we begin," Marcus announced, "I want to make it clear that this meeting is being recorded and that all participants have the right to legal representation." Richard's face went pale as he realized this was far more serious than he had anticipated. He had probably expected a routine meeting where he could dismiss my allegations as the complaints of a disgruntled employee. Instead, he was facing what amounted to a formal investigation with potential legal consequences. "Dr. Reed," Marcus continued, "you've presented serious allegations regarding departmental operations and personnel management. Would you please summarize your findings for the board?" I opened my presentation folder and began laying out the evidence systematically. The digital forensics showing Richard's pattern of claiming credit for other employees' work. The financial analysis demonstrating the cost of his poor decision-making. The documentation of David Morrison's incompetence and the resulting client relationship failures. But I started with something Richard hadn't expected. A comprehensive timeline showing that his fraudulent behavior had been escalating over the past 3 years, coinciding with his promotion to executive vice president and his increased compensation. The pattern shows systematic credit theft that directly influenced Mr. Hartwell's performance evaluations and financial compensation, I explained, highlighting key dates on the timeline. This constitutes fraud under both state and federal law. Richard finally found his voice. "This is completely inappropriate," he said, his tone carrying the authority he was accustomed to wielding. "Dr. Reed is a disgruntled employee who's trying to damage the company because she wasn't promoted. These allegations are baseless and motivated by personal revenge. I had anticipated this defense and was prepared for it." "Mr. Hartwell," I replied calmly, "the evidence I'm presenting consists primarily of your own emails and documents. Are you suggesting that you falsified your own communications?" Sarah Mitchell leaned forward. "Mr. Hartwell, I should inform you that making false statements during this proceeding could constitute additional legal violations. I'd recommend that you carefully consider your responses." The warning had its intended effect. Richard's bluster deflated as he realized that anything he said could be used against him in potential legal proceedings. David Morrison looked like he was trying to disappear into his chair. I continued with the presentation, methodically destroying Richard's credibility piece by piece. The emails where he had taken credit for my process optimization system. The presentations where he had used my client relationship strategies without attribution. The performance reviews where he had claimed responsibility for revenue increases that were directly attributable to my innovations. The financial impact of Mr. Hartwell's misrepresentation extends beyond just the credit theft, I explained. His fundamental misunderstanding of the strategies he was claiming to have developed led to poor implementation decisions that cost the company substantial revenue. I pulled out the Pinnacle Industries case study, showing how David Morrison's incompetent strategic advice had been based on my research but applied incorrectly because neither Richard nor David understood the underlying analysis. The potential liability exposure from this single incident could exceed $500,000, I continued. But it's not an isolated case. We've identified at least 6 other instances where inappropriate strategic advice was provided based on plagiarized work that wasn't properly understood. Board member Janet Williams, who had always been one of Richard's supporters, looked genuinely shocked. "Are you saying that we've been providing clients with incorrect strategic advice?" "I'm saying that clients have been receiving advice from consultants who didn't understand the research they were presenting," I replied. "The advice itself was often sound, but it was frequently applied to inappropriate situations because the people delivering it didn't comprehend the context or limitations of the analysis." Dr. Patricia Williams chose this moment to intervene. "If I may," she said, "this type of systematic fraud creates serious governance issues for the board. Failing to address it could expose individual board members to personal liability, particularly if clients file lawsuits claiming they received negligent professional advice." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. The board members weren't just dealing with an internal personnel issue. They were facing potential personal legal consequences if they failed to take appropriate action. Richard made one final attempt to salvage his position. "Even if there were some communication issues about project attribution," he said, "the departmental performance has been exceptional. We've exceeded every target, improved client satisfaction, and increased revenue significantly." This was the moment I had been waiting for. I pulled out the financial analysis that Elena had helped me prepare, showing the actual performance metrics stripped of Richard's distortions and misrepresentations. "Mr. Hartwell," I said, "the departmental performance you're claiming credit for was achieved despite your leadership, not because of it. When we analyze the revenue increases and efficiency improvements objectively, they correlate directly with specific innovations that were developed by other employees." I displayed a chart showing the timeline of improvements versus the timeline of my project implementations. The correlation was undeniable. Furthermore, I continued, the analysis shows that Mr. Hartwell's direct contributions to departmental performance have been consistently negative. His decisions have reduced efficiency, increased costs, and created client relationship problems that required significant resources to resolve. Board member Thomas Rodriguez leaned forward. "Are you saying that Mr. Hartwell has been a net negative for the department?" "I'm saying that the evidence shows Mr. Hartwell's actual contributions have detracted from, rather than enhanced, departmental performance." I replied. The positive results he's been taking credit for were achieved by other employees, often in spite of his interference. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at the presentation materials as if they might spontaneously combust, while David Morrison appeared to be having some kind of existential crisis. Marcus Chen broke the silence. Mr. Hartwell, how do you respond to these specific allegations? Richard's response was exactly what I had expected and hoped for. Instead of addressing the evidence, he attacked my credibility and motivations. This is clearly a coordinated attack by a disgruntled employee who couldn't accept legitimate business decisions, he said. Dr. Reed was passed over for promotion because she lacks the strategic vision and leadership qualities necessary for executive positions. This entire presentation is just an elaborate attempt to damage the company because she didn't get what she wanted. Sarah Mitchell smiled slightly. Richard had just made several statements that could be easily disproven, and that demonstrated exactly the kind of arrogance and dismissiveness that had created this situation in the first place. Mr. Hartwell, I said, since you've questioned my strategic vision and leadership qualities, perhaps you could explain to the board which specific strategic initiatives you personally developed and implemented over the past 3 years. The question was a trap, and Richard walked directly into it. He began describing various projects and initiatives, clearly trying to demonstrate his strategic contributions. But every example he gave was something I could prove he had stolen from other employees. As he spoke, I quietly arranged documents on the table, preparing to systematically demolish each claim he made. When he finished, I began my rebuttal. The process optimization system Mr. Hartwell just described was developed by me in March 2023, I said, producing the original research documents with timestamps. Here are my preliminary notes, my research methodology, and my implementation timeline. I continued through each of his examples, producing evidence that showed the original work had been done by other employees. The board members' expressions grew increasingly grave as they realized the extent of Richard's deception. Mr. Hartwell, board member Michael Foster said, do you have any documentation showing your personal development of these initiatives? Richard's silence was answer enough. He had never developed any original strategic initiatives because he had been too busy stealing credit for other people's work. David Morrison finally spoke up, apparently deciding that his best strategy was to distance himself from Richard's fraud. I think there may have been some misunderstandings about project attribution, he said carefully. I was told that Mr. Hartwell had developed the strategic frameworks I've been working with, but if that's not accurate, I apologize for any confusion. The statement was perfectly calculated to protect David while throwing Richard completely under the bus. It also provided the board with a face-saving narrative that allowed them to blame the problems on Richard's individual misconduct rather than systemic failures in corporate oversight. Marcus Chen looked around the table, clearly recognizing that the situation had reached a point where decisive action was necessary. Based on the evidence presented, he said, I'm recommending that the board authorize an immediate comprehensive audit of departmental operations and personnel decisions. I'm also recommending that Mr. Hartwell be placed on administrative leave pending the completion of that audit. Richard's face went ashen. You can't do this based on unsubstantiated allegations from a vindictive employee, he protested. Mr. Hartwell, Sarah Mitchell interjected, the allegations are extensively substantiated with documentary evidence, much of which consists of your own communications. Continuing to characterize them as unsubstantiated could constitute defamation of my client. The legal warning effectively ended Richard's protests. He had been outmaneuvered completely, trapped by his own arrogance and the comprehensive evidence of his systematic fraud. The board voted unanimously to accept Marcus's recommendations. Richard Hartwell was immediately suspended from his position, pending the results of a formal investigation. David Morrison was reassigned to a junior consulting role with significantly reduced responsibilities and compensation. As the meeting concluded, I felt a satisfaction that was both personal and professional. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Sterling Technologies would be protected from the continued damage that Richard's incompetence and fraud would have caused. Richard gathered his papers with shaking hands, clearly struggling to process how completely his world had collapsed in a single meeting. As he prepared to leave, he turned to me with a look of pure hatred. You think you've won something, he said quietly, but you've just destroyed your own career. No one will hire someone who turns against their own company. I smiled at him with genuine pity. Richard, I said, I didn't turn against the company. I saved it from you. The aftermath moved quickly. Within a week, the comprehensive audit had confirmed every allegation I had made and revealed additional instances of fraud and mismanagement. Richard was terminated for cause, forfeiting his severance package and benefits. Several clients who had received inappropriate strategic advice were identified and contacted for remediation discussions. The investigation also revealed that Richard had been inflating his expense reports and using company resources for personal projects, adding additional grounds for potential criminal charges. The district attorney's office opened a preliminary investigation into possible fraud charges, though they ultimately decided that the financial amounts involved didn't warrant criminal prosecution. David Morrison lasted another month before his fundamental incompetence became impossible to ignore. He was quietly terminated during the post-holiday downsizing, his brief tenure at Sterling Technologies ending as ignominiously as it had begun. The most satisfying development was the response from Sterling's clients. Once the audit results were shared with affected companies, several of them specifically requested that I be involved in developing corrective strategic recommendations. My consulting practice, which I had been planning to launch anyway, immediately had a substantial client base and strong references. Pinnacle Industries not only withdrew their lawsuit, but offered me a lucrative consulting contract to develop a comprehensive operational strategy based on accurate analysis of their actual business situation. The irony was perfect. Richard's fraud had ultimately created opportunities for me that would never have existed if he had simply treated me fairly. 6 months later, I was running a successful independent consulting practice from an office downtown, working with clients who valued expertise over politics and honesty over corporate gamesmanship. My income had doubled, my work satisfaction had improved dramatically, and I had the freedom to choose projects that aligned with my professional values. The Chen Reed Consulting Group, named in honor of Elena Vasquez Chen, who had become my business partner, specialized in operational efficiency and strategic development for mid-sized companies. Our reputation for honest analysis and practical solutions had generated more business than we could handle. Elena had left Sterling Technologies 3 months after my departure, tired of watching incompetent managers take credit for her technical innovations. Together, we had built a practice that prioritized employee development and recognition, ensuring that the people who did the work received appropriate credit and compensation. Jennifer Walsh had also joined our company after completing her MBA, becoming our Director of Client Relations. Her experience at Sterling had taught her valuable lessons about recognizing and avoiding toxic corporate environments. The industry recognition was particularly gratifying. I was invited to speak at conferences about operational efficiency and strategic development, sharing insights that had been developed through years of hands-on experience rather than theoretical study. The same expertise that Richard had dismissed as detail work was now being recognized as cutting-edge strategic thinking. But the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Marcus Chen contacted me a year after my departure to discuss a consulting contract for Sterling Technologies. The company was struggling with operational issues and client relationship problems that had emerged after my departure and the subsequent management changes. We need someone who understands our systems and can help us rebuild the departmental culture, Marcus explained during our meeting. Would you be interested in a consulting contract to help us develop better operational strategies? The irony was exquisite. Sterling Technologies wanted to hire me as an external consultant to fix the problems that Richard's incompetence had created. The woman he had called Deadweight was now being asked to save the department he had nearly destroyed. I accepted the contract, but on my terms. The consulting fee was triple what my Sterling salary had been. I would work with their staff to develop sustainable systems that prevented the kind of credit theft and fraud that had flourished under Richard's leadership. Most importantly, I would have complete autonomy to implement recommendations without interference from corporate politics. The Sterling project became a case study in organizational transformation. Within 6 months, departmental efficiency had improved by 40%, client satisfaction ratings had reached all-time highs, and employee morale had recovered from the damage caused by Richard's toxic leadership style. The success of the Sterling turnaround generated additional opportunities throughout the industry. Companies that had heard about the transformation wanted similar results for their own operations. The consulting practice grew beyond anything I'd imagined when I first started planning my departure from corporate employment. 3 years after that December evening when Richard had called me Deadweight, I was recognized as one of the region's leading experts in operational strategy and organizational development. The same analytical skills and attention to detail that he had dismissed as unsuitable for strategic thinking were now being sought after by Fortune 500 companies. The personal transformation was just as significant as the professional success. I had learned to value my own expertise and to demand recognition for my contributions. More importantly, I had learned that sometimes the best response to being undervalued is to find people who understand your worth. Richard Hartwell had faded into obscurity, his reputation in the industry permanently damaged by the revelations about his systematic fraud. Last I heard, he was working for a small accounting firm in another state, his executive career effectively ended by his own arrogance and dishonesty. The lesson was clear and powerful. Calling someone deadweight can be a career-ending mistake when that person happens to be more competent, more strategic, and more prepared than you ever imagined. Richard had underestimated me because he confused compliance with weakness and collaboration with inability. But the real victory wasn't just personal vindication. It was the knowledge that I had protected Sterling Technologies from continued damage, helped expose systematic fraud that could have destroyed careers and client relationships, and ultimately contributed to creating a healthier corporate environment for future employees. Sometimes justice comes not through dramatic confrontations or public humiliation, but through the quiet satisfaction of proving that competence and integrity ultimately triumph over fraud and incompetence. Richard had taught me that lesson without meaning to, and I had applied it with a precision that he never saw coming. The deadweight he had tried to discard had become the anchor that saved his former company from drowning in the consequences of his own failures. And that, I realized, was the most perfect revenge of all. The validation that came from industry recognition was deeply satisfying. But the most meaningful moment arrived 18 months after my departure from Sterling Technologies. I was attending the National Operations Management Conference in Chicago, where I had been invited to deliver the keynote address on transforming organizational culture through strategic leadership. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now being recognized as a thought leader in strategic management, the very area where Richard had claimed I lacked vision and capability. The audience of 500 senior executives and consultants represented the kind of professional recognition that Richard had always craved but never achieved through legitimate means. As I took the stage, I caught sight of a familiar face in the audience. Dr. Margaret Caldwell, Sterling's former chief operating officer, was sitting in the third row, smiling with obvious pride. Margaret had been one of the few senior executives who had consistently recognized my contributions, though she had been powerless to protect me from Richard's systematic undermining. The greatest challenge in modern organizational management, I began my presentation, isn't developing innovative strategies or implementing efficient systems. It's creating cultures where competence is valued over politics, where contributions are recognized regardless of who makes them, and where toxic leadership is identified and eliminated before it can cause systemic damage. The presentation drew heavily on my experience at Sterling Technologies, though I was careful not to identify the company or individuals involved. Instead, I focused on the patterns of behavior that allowed incompetent managers to thrive while undermining genuinely valuable employees. Credit theft isn't just a personal grievance issue, I explained to the audience. It's a form of organizational cancer that destroys innovation, undermines morale, and ultimately damages the company's competitive position. When managers systematically claim ownership of their subordinates' work, they create environments where talented people either leave or stop contributing meaningful ideas. The response from the audience was immediate and engaged. During the question and answer session, dozens of executives shared similar experiences from their own organizations. It became clear that Richard's behavior wasn't an isolated phenomenon, but rather a widespread problem that many companies struggled to address effectively. After the presentation, Margaret approached me in the hotel lobby, her expression mixing professional admiration with personal regret. "Samantha," she said, "that was extraordinary. I wish we had recognized what was happening at Sterling before we lost you." Margaret's comment opened a conversation that revealed the broader impact my departure had created within the company. Apparently, my resignation had prompted several other talented employees to reevaluate their own situations and career prospects. "We lost 4 more senior staff members within 6 months of your departure," Margaret explained. All of them cited concerns about recognition and advancement opportunities. It took us almost a year to understand that Richard's management style was driving away our best people. The revelation was both satisfying and sobering. My experience hadn't been unique. It had been part of a pattern that was systematically destroying Sterling's human capital. Richard's toxic leadership had created a brain drain that was only recognized after the damage had been done. "There's something else you should know," Margaret continued. "The board commissioned an external consulting firm to conduct a comprehensive review of our management practices and organizational culture. The recommendations were almost identical to the operational improvements you had been proposing for years. The irony was perfect. Sterling Technologies had paid external consultants substantial fees to tell them what I had been trying to communicate for free as their employee. The insights that Richard had dismissed as lacking strategic vision were now being implemented as cutting-edge management practices. Margaret's information also revealed the long-term consequences of Richard's fraud. The comprehensive audit had uncovered additional instances of credit theft affecting multiple departments, not just operations. The pattern of managers claiming subordinates' work had been more widespread than anyone had realized, creating a culture where innovation was discouraged and talented employees felt undervalued. "The cultural transformation has been significant," Margaret explained. "We've implemented new policies requiring clear attribution for strategic recommendations and project contributions. We've also established anonymous reporting mechanisms for employees who believe their work isn't being properly recognized." The changes at Sterling represented exactly the kind of systemic reform that could have prevented my situation if they had been implemented earlier. But they had only come about as a result of the crisis created by Richard's exposure and the subsequent talent exodus. Our conversation was interrupted by Tom Richardson, a senior partner at McKinsey who had been in the audience for my presentation. Tom's approach was professional but clearly motivated by business opportunity. "Dr. Reed," he said, "I was impressed by your analysis of organizational dysfunction. We're working with several clients who are dealing with similar cultural issues. Would you be interested in discussing potential collaboration opportunities?" The offer represented a significant expansion opportunity for my consulting practice. McKinsey's client base included Fortune 100 companies with complex organizational challenges that aligned perfectly with my expertise in operational strategy and cultural transformation. "I'd be very interested," I replied. "My practice focuses specifically on identifying and eliminating the kind of toxic management patterns that destroy organizational effectiveness." Tom's enthusiasm was immediate. "That's exactly what we need. We have clients who've implemented excellent strategic plans, but are struggling with execution because of internal cultural problems. Your approach of combining operational efficiency with cultural analysis could be revolutionary." The McKinsey partnership that developed from that conversation transformed my consulting practice from a regional operation into a national presence. Within 6 months, I was working with major corporations across multiple industries, helping them identify and eliminate the kind of systematic dysfunction that had characterized my experience at Sterling. The work was intellectually challenging and professionally satisfying in ways that my corporate employment had never been. Instead of fighting internal politics to implement obvious improvements, I was being paid substantial fees to provide expert analysis that clients actually wanted to hear and implement. One particularly significant engagement involved Meridian Financial, a mid-sized investment firm that was struggling with high employee turnover and declining client satisfaction. The surface problems appeared to be compensation-related, but my analysis revealed a familiar pattern of credit theft and toxic management that was destroying employee morale. "The issues you're experiencing aren't compensation problems," I explained to their executive team during my presentation. "They're recognition problems. Your talented employees are leaving because their contributions aren't being acknowledged, not because they're underpaid." The investigation at Meridian uncovered a situation remarkably similar to my experience at Sterling. Several senior managers had been systematically claiming credit for subordinates' work, creating an environment where innovative thinking was discouraged and talented employees felt invisible. The transformation at Meridian became another case study in the power of cultural reform. Within a year of implementing my recommendations, employee turnover had decreased by 60%, client satisfaction had improved dramatically, and the company's financial performance had exceeded projections by substantial margins. But the most personally meaningful project came from an unexpected source. Elena contacted me with an opportunity that would bring my career full circle in the most satisfying way possible. "Sam," she said during our lunch meeting, "I've been approached by a group of former Sterling employees who want to start their own consulting firm. They're looking for someone with your expertise to help them develop the business model and operational structure." The group included Jennifer Walsh, Marcus Webb from Financial Analysis, Lisa Chen from Client Relations, and Tom Rodriguez from Quality Assurance. All of them had left Sterling in the aftermath of Richard's exposure, and all of them had maintained their commitment to the kind of collaborative, merit-based approach to business that had been impossible under his leadership. "We want to create the kind of company we wished Sterling had been," Jennifer explained when we met to discuss the opportunity. "A place where good work is recognized, where people are promoted based on competence rather than politics, and where toxic management is identified and eliminated before it can cause damage." Their vision aligned perfectly with the principles I had been advocating throughout my consulting career. More than that, it represented an opportunity to demonstrate that the alternative to toxic corporate culture wasn't just theoretical but practical and profitable. The firm we created together, Collaborative Strategic Solutions, became a laboratory for implementing the management practices that had been suppressed at Sterling. Every employee was recognized for their individual contributions. Strategic decisions were made collaboratively, with input from people who would actually implement the recommendations. Most importantly, we established clear policies preventing any manager from claiming credit for subordinates' work. The success of Collaborative Strategic Solutions exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 2 years, we had grown from 6 founding members to over 40 employees, with clients throughout the Midwest and expanding into national markets. Our reputation for delivering results while maintaining ethical management practices attracted both talented employees and high-value clients. The company's success also provided an opportunity for personal vindication that was more satisfying than anything I could have imagined. We were invited to bid on a major consulting contract with Sterling Technologies, who were struggling with operational efficiency issues that had emerged after their cultural transformation efforts had stalled. Walking back into the Sterling building for the presentation meeting felt surreal. The same marble lobby where I had once waited nervously for performance reviews now seemed smaller and less intimidating. The conference room where Richard had once dismissed my strategic recommendations was now the site of my company's proposal to solve problems that his leadership had created. Marcus Chen, who was still CEO, greeted me with obvious respect and what appeared to be genuine regret about how my departure had been handled. "Samantha," he said, "I want you to know that losing you was one of the biggest mistakes we've made as an organization. Your insights about our operational problems were completely accurate, and we should have listened more carefully." The admission was gratifying, but what really mattered was the opportunity to demonstrate how much value I could create when given appropriate recognition and authority. The proposal we presented addressed every major operational issue that Sterling was facing, with specific recommendations based on successful implementations at other client companies. The efficiency improvements we're proposing, I explained to the Sterling executive team, are based on the same analytical framework I tried to implement here 5 years ago. The difference is that we now have documented evidence from multiple client engagements, proving the effectiveness of these approaches. The presentation was flawless, but the real satisfaction came from seeing the executives' faces as they realized the magnitude of opportunity they had missed by failing to retain me. The woman they had allowed Richard to drive away had become exactly the kind of strategic partner they desperately needed. Collaborative Strategic Solutions won the Sterling contract, but I assigned the project implementation to Jennifer and Marcus Webb. I had proven my point and demonstrated my value. Actually returning to work at Sterling, even as an external consultant, would have felt like moving backward rather than forward. The industry recognition that followed the Sterling engagement opened doors to opportunities I had never imagined. Harvard Business School invited me to teach a graduate seminar on organizational transformation. The Wall Street Journal featured my work in a series on innovative management practices. Fortune magazine included me in their list of rising stars in business consulting. But the most meaningful recognition came from the employees whose careers had been transformed by implementing the management practices I advocated. I received dozens of letters and emails from people who had moved to companies with healthier cultures, started their own businesses, or simply found work environments where their contributions were valued and recognized. One letter particularly stood out, from a young analyst who had left Sterling shortly after my departure and was now thriving at a technology startup. "Dr. Reed," she wrote, "watching how you handled your situation taught me that I didn't have to accept being undervalued. Your example gave me the courage to demand better, and it changed my entire career trajectory. Thank you for showing me that competence and integrity don't have to be sacrificed for professional success." The letter reminded me that the real victory hadn't been personal vindication or professional success, though both had been deeply satisfying. The real victory had been demonstrating that toxic management could be challenged successfully, and that alternatives to dysfunctional corporate culture were not only possible but profitable. 5 years after that December evening when Richard had called me Deadweight, I was recognized as one of the leading experts in organizational transformation and strategic management. The consulting practice had grown into a nationally recognized firm. The management principles I advocated were being taught in business schools and implemented by major corporations. Richard Hartwell had disappeared entirely from the professional landscape, his reputation permanently destroyed by the revelations about his systematic fraud. The last I heard, he was working in an administrative role at a small municipal government office, his executive career permanently ended by his own arrogance and dishonesty. The contrast between our trajectories was stark and instructive. Richard had tried to build success by stealing other people's accomplishments, while I had achieved recognition by helping others succeed. He had created value for himself by destroying opportunities for his subordinates, while I had built a career by ensuring that talented people received appropriate recognition and compensation. The lesson was clear and powerful. Sustainable success cannot be built on fraud and exploitation. Organizations that allow toxic managers to thrive ultimately destroy their own competitive advantages. Companies that recognize and develop talent, regardless of internal politics, create sustainable competitive advantages that benefit everyone involved. Looking back on that transformative evening at the company party, I realized that Richard had actually done me a favor by revealing his true character so publicly. His cruelty had forced me to recognize that I was wasting my talents in an environment that would never value them appropriately. His betrayal had given me the motivation to build something better than anything I could have achieved within Sterling's dysfunctional culture. The deadweight he had tried to discard had become the foundation for transforming how organizations think about talent development and employee recognition. And that transformation, I knew, would continue long after both of our careers had ended, benefiting countless employees who would never have to endure the kind of systematic exploitation that had once seemed inevitable in corporate America. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.